Welcome back to the third episode of DeCOMPOSED, a podcast about classical music and equity. I'm Sam Heichelbech, co-host with Calista Goldwasser. Hey, Calista.
Hey, great to have you both here.
Well, thank you all for joining us. Calista and I are joined today by our guest, Devin Dolquist, also a graduate of DePauw University. Hey, Devin.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Sam?
I'm doing just wonderful on this very cold, blustery Chicago day. We wanted to kind of just maybe go ahead and leap in and maybe introduce yourself a little bit about, your background other than just attending DePauw University.
So I graduated from DePauw in 2019. I got a BMA and my main instrument was bassoon, but I did a lot of singing as well. And when I was about a sophomore, I came out as trans. And in my final semester at DePauw, I started hormone replacement therapy. So I started taking testosterone. Which drastically affected my singing voice and also led me to pursue a master's degree in speech-language pathology. And so now here I am.
Very, very cool. We'd love to kind of have a bit of a casual conversation about what your transness has meant in the musical world, because obviously being trans comes with a lot of challenges, regardless of what field of study you're in or field of profession you're in. But when your actual literal voice is what you use to make music, and suddenly you're going through a whole second puberty of sorts, that's almost uncharted territory to the average person who knows nothing about this. And it's something that I feel like we don't really talk about a lot because it's just something that people handle and figure out on their own. But how have you felt that your kind of musical experience and your musical just identity has changed from before you began taking TM from after, now that you were pretty well adjusted, singing in choir, post voice drop, and all of that stuff?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because even though voice wasn't like my main instrument, it was still something that I really loved. And also, is even if you are an instrumentalist getting a music degree, you still have to do a lot of singing. And when you start taking testosterone, which is sort of one form of hormone replacement therapy for transmasculine people, or anyone who wants to take it, I guess, it involves your voice just completely changing. And that was something that was so terrifying for me, because even though, voice wasn't my main instrument, and even though I wasn't, involved in musicals and operas and all that stuff the way that a voice major would be, I still had a really close connection to my voice, which ultimately was just really difficult, mostly because I loved singing, but what I sounded like just wasn't what I wanted, and it didn't really feel representative of actually who I was as a person. And I'm sure we'll get more into this later, but then if you have a certain voice type, you are then cast as certain roles, and you sing certain songs. And I just didn't have any interest at all in becoming a really good mezzo, or even trying to sing soprano ever. It just wasn't a part of my voice that I used. And so even though I really loved my voice and I loved singing, I also felt this just really strange and painful disconnect. And so I had a lot of mixed feelings about starting testosterone, because I knew that I was just gonna have to start over. Because that's what happens when you go through puberty, right? Your voice just totally changes, and a lot of times it's not a huge deal because you're 13 or whatever, and you haven't taken voice lessons, and you don't have really a relationship with your voice quite yet. Maybe some people do, but they know that it's not going to be the same forever as they grow up. So for me, when it dropped, and when I was thinking about in the future it dropping, it was just so scary because I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know where I was going to end up. So that was something that actually really delayed my decision to start taking testosterone. I probably could have started years before I did, but I was just so truly just, it was all fear, and a lack of resources to handle it. So eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. So I just did, and I did a lot of research, and I did my first testosterone injection with Sam by my side. And it's been 2 years now, almost exactly, and a lot has changed, and I love the way my voice sounds now, but it still hasn't stopped changing, which is wild.
Yeah, I obviously remember that injection very distinctly. Very infamous point in some degrees, because I am very squeamish with needles, so
yeah,
I had to look away.
I am very glad that I wasn't there for that. I don't like needles.
Yeah, I was laying on a bed and I almost passed out, like just
true.
laying on the bed. So that was not reflect well on my ability to deal with the medical profession. But you mentioned, Devin, that a lot of the uncertainty surrounding like the transition and taking tea was a lot of unknowing, like where your voice would fall. And you actually mentioned that this is a continuing process. But were there other like trans examples that you could kind of look to, or much research done in that area for you to draw on, or was this mostly like a shot in the dark?
There was nothing. There was, I mean, you know, if you Google it, it'll come up with maybe some famous trans singers, but there isn't a lot of exploration in the actual like technical logistical side of what's happening, at least not for a singer, because you kind of, there's like two fields that you'll come into. There's the side of like people doing interviews with one of two famous trans opera singers and saying like, wow, you're so brave, and what was this like for you emotionally, which is like, everyone is different, and so it's not super helpful. And the other field is the field of speech language pathology, which is a little bit more helpful and a little bit more physics based. And so that helped me more so kind of figure out what was happening inside my body, but it was all about speech and language because it's speech language pathology. It wasn't really about singing. So I had a voice teacher who had never actually taught trans students before. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because my cat is currently on my shoulders. And even though she didn't have any experience with trans clients or trans students, she read a lot of books, which I appreciated. And it is pretty similar to just like if you're a cis man going through puberty for the first time. So like in your body, it's pretty similar to what happens then, but emotionally it's just completely different. Because you're just going through such a huge transition as a 21, 22-year-old, for me, at least. So I mostly had to just dive really, really deeply into all of the research that had ever been done that I could find. The most helpful thing that I found was a doctorate thesis of someone from CU Boulder who wrote their thesis on what happens to the trans singing voice in the first 2 years of testosterone therapy, which was the most like nail on the head thing I could possibly find. Otherwise, it was just a lot of picking and choosing, and that comes with its own accessibility issues because it was all academic. So if you don't have sort of the academic training to be able to decipher articles that sound and look like that, or if you just straight up like don't have access to those databases, then you're just out of luck. So I really forged my own path in a lot of ways, and it was really hard.
Yeah. And it's something that everyone's got struggles in music. Everyone's trying to figure out their voices. No one else in a small music program like DePauw is going through anything even remotely similar to that. Like there's not really anything to compare it to. I mean, obviously there's comparing it to like the voice drop of a cis 13-year-old boy, but like at a collegiate level in a school of music like this, everyone else has already kind of got their voices mostly figured out, besides like, oh no, I keep cracking on my high C, boo-hoo. Yeah. But like, there's no, I mean, true.
No, it's total switch like, in the gender part roles that you'd be doing, like that you experienced, which I think was maybe possibly one of the most like stunning examples was I believe you recorded on either on your phone or your computer your progressive voice drop. And I can actually remember calling you one day, and I got your voicemail from like that you had recorded like 2 years prior to going on T, and I did not recognize the person on the voicemail because it was just like it had changed so drastically, and like a complete like I don't know alto to now I would say a tenor to baritone maybe.
Yeah, I am a bass now.
Yeah,
like
or even lower.
Tried and true. It's wild. And it's so funny because I had spent my entire alto career, which I'm putting in air quotes, pretending to be a tenor and trying to sing tenory songs and not quite being able to hit the low notes. And then my voice dropped by like a fifth. And I was like, great, it can stop now. Because that was what I was used to. And then it just kept going. And so it actually passed the point of being able to sing tenory stuff. And to detail like what exactly happened in terms of my range, it happened very quickly to me, whereas for other people it doesn't quite happen so quickly. But I believe what happened was like I had a range of about 3 octaves, but I didn't use an octave and a half of that, kind of on the top end, because I didn't care for it. That was the first thing to go. And then I would kind of literally like week by week, I would add like a half step to the low like range, you know. And it kind of just shifted down that way. And for a while, I only have just started to grow out of this, but like I just kind of had an octave on the bottom and that was about it. No falsetto. Every time I tried to sing high, it would just come out as a wheeze or like a whisper, which I was very sad about. And now that it's 2 years later, it's kind of just starting to settle, and that's just now starting to come back. So singing tenor, like, forget about it. No way.
Wow. I think your voice might be lower than mine because I'm like a baritone, but bass for me is like kind of sometimes challenging. So it's such a change in the time I've known you.
Yeah.
Yeah, and based on the way that I look, people think that I'm a tenor. So I'm in this, which is a whole other thing.
Yes,
I'm sure
very
we can
true.
talk
Yeah, and honestly, let's get into it at some point.
Well, so if we're talking about gender roles in opera, for example, or musical theater, even just the arias that you sing, the musicals that you do, whatever, I think we can all agree that there's a pretty standard set of like the tenor is the hero, the baritone is the villain, and at least in like musical theater, the tenor is not actually, or the baritone is not actually going to sing that low. The baritone is like actually secretly a tenor too. But like the lower songs are like the more sinister or whatever, right? And then there are parallels of that in higher voices. So you have like the alto who's the old lady, and then the soprano who's the like lady hero, or the one being rescued, depending on what musical you're watching. And so based on the way that I look, which is like short, white, dainty, perhaps, I would be cast based on my appearance in more of the like tenory roles because I don't look very menacing and I'm not very big. And that extends not only just in classical music, but the first time I went to one of my sectionals in my new choir in Minneapolis, I walked into the bass sectional and one of the guys kind of like looked at me and sort of like looked around him and he said, "The tenor sectionals are downstairs."
Oh.
And I was like, this is a gay choir. Why are you being so judgy right now? And what a nice segue into talking about that particular choir. I don't need you to ask me questions. I'm just going to go for it, apparently.
Excellent.
So I'm in a chorus called One Voice Makes Chorus, and it is the Twin Cities LGBTQ and ally chorus, like the premier one. It's been around for, I don't know, like 30 plus years at least, maybe closer to 50, not sure. And there are 125 members, and almost everyone is queer, and certainly everyone is at least like very knowledgeable about queer stuff and is like immersed in the community in some way or another. And that is the first choral space I've ever been in that had any sort of nuance or care to how they were addressing people in terms of their gender within the space. Which really is as easy as just saying tenors and basses instead of men. Because we have several trans women in the bass section, several non-binary people in the alto and tenor section in particular. And that is so empowering and takes like half a second longer. And I've had choral directors in my experience say, well, there's valuable rehearsal time and it seems like just kind of a waste to say sopranos and altos. It's just easier to say women. It takes less time, which is really indicative of where the priorities are.
Right? Yeah. Also, like if sopranos and altos is too much, you can say treble. That's also fine.
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, actually to that, I absolutely agree with the big difference between saying women versus saying sopranos and altos, or saying men versus tenors and basses. The words soprano, alto, tenor, bass, mezzo, all of that already, even if you take out the added layer of straight up just saying the genders associated with those, they're very, very gendered terms.
Yeah.
And so even though it's obviously so much better to say that than it is to just assume the genders of the people singing those voices, it's like it's built into the terminology that voice parts are gendered, like explicitly so. Are there other ways that we can kind of describe, or what kind of have you seen besides just referring to the voices as the voices rather than the genders, as a way to kind of not jump to the terminology that we use, which is like super gendered?
Yeah, there are a lot of people who have sort of invented their own terms. One that I've come across a lot for trans women who sing bass is contralto basso. So with the association of being an alto, but like just a very low alto, which I quite like, and sort of depends on the comfort of the person. Or so like also to kind of go along with that, trans women or trans feminine people, when they take hormones, their voice does not get higher. So some people might choose to stay in their like tenor, baritone, bass range, or they might train in their falsetto and be, sopranos, altos, or sort of like in that mezzo kind of area.
It's interesting because that term already exists for men to sing higher, but not the alternative. I mean, I guess technically contralto exists, but like no one uses that because that doesn't exist naturally without hormones. I mean, like maybe every once in a while, but it's not a very common voice part.
But it's so interesting because that's where it overlaps. That's where everyone can actually sing, is right in that middle range.
Yeah.
And yet, when a man sings that range, we call it countertenor, and when a woman sings that range, we call it contralto, instead of just having some sort of gender-neutral term for it. So the answer to your question is we have to make them up. And people can pick and choose from what already exists, or you can just invent your own thing. But then you have to explain it to anyone who ever asks if you invent your own thing, which can be really tough.
Because, I mean, as logical as it is to say this woman here sings tenor, the natural assumption with tenor is that's a man's voice part. Yeah. And, I mean, like, that sounds, very limiting, but the reality is that is exactly what it is, that the parts that are written to be sung by a tenor voice are male characters, which I guess gets into a whole different conversation of outside of like choral context, but in actual shows, operas, musicals, whatever it is, then if you are of a voice part that doesn't necessarily align with the gender that you identify as. Yeah. So I've seen examples where people are comfortable, and I guess this really comes down to personal preference, but whether it's a comfortable thing to play roles of a gender that you no longer identify with, or whether it's better to, gender swap a character, whether it still works functionally to do that, and if so, whether that's preferable, or whether that just draws more attention to it. It's, it's a lose-lose, but... Yeah, and it, like, again, it's just kind of up to the individual and their own comfort levels and what they want to do. I personally am always a fan of making operas and musicals and everything gayer. So if you just want to switch the gender of a character, and if they have a love story, then make it gay, like, absolutely, let's go right now. Like, this isn't opera or musical theater, but I saw a gay Hamlet with a lesbian Hamlet, and that was super fun. Yeah, absolutely. And like, getting into kind of a whole other thing, it's new, and we're reinventing, which is kind of what 21st century musician, etc., is all about. Because there are people who are going to go see Don Giovanni every year because they love it, but those people are probably white, and they're probably old, and they probably have a lot of money. And probably have some problematic views about, consent and stuff, but... Right. And if you change it to make it more accessible, a different story, just like told in a different way,
people, that's just like more accessible for everyone, and you'll make more money. So in that situation, it's kind of a win-win. But the nuance of gender bending a role is a little bit more complicated. And so, for example, Lucia Lucas is probably one of the most famous trans women opera singers right now, who is playing Don Giovanni. Was in the before COVID times for the Tulsa Opera, I think. And she personally is super comfortable playing a man, because one of the quotes of hers that I really like is, I've been practicing that skill my whole life. Meaning, you know, she was pretending to be a man for a really long time, but she isn't. And so she's pretty good at acting like one, you know, which I think is a really interesting way to look at it. And then there are transmasculine people who haven't taken hormones but only play pants roles, which is just like a built-in gender bend, you know, which is great. And
I almost forgot that was like right there.
Yeah. There are opportunities, right? But if you, like, for example, if you're a trans woman and you don't want to play the role of a man, but your voice is low, then you have to find a director who's going to be okay with that. Get the music transposed into a different key, maybe, or just like sing it an octave lower. And that's just so limiting. It's already such a competitive field, that it's just really difficult to find those opportunities unless they just literally fall into your lap, and almost impossible to make money with unless you're like super famous, you know?
Yeah.
So.
Because to that exact point with the making money, while there are going to be cool, like, conscientious directors who are interested in, I mean, that it's not even like avant-garde really, it's just, you know, kind, but but more out there ideas of what an opera can look like, those aren't going to be the companies that have the budgets to pay people well. Those aren't going to be the kinds of opportunities where you can actually, you know, I don't know if anyone can really make a career performing opera these days. Opera is currently closed, but just in general, like, the kinds of opportunities that are going to be well funded are going to be the big opera houses that are doing the warhorse pieces like La Boheme and Marriage of Figaro and things like that, which absolutely could be, you know, messed with a little bit, but won't be. And so it adds an extra layer of, beyond the fact that it's possible, the opportunities where you can actually make good money. Good is in quotes. There's no good money in music. Yeah. But you didn't hear that from me.
And all of those are funded by old white people.
Exactly.
Who love opera and aren't going to go see the show and aren't going to fund it if it's not exactly what they want.
Yeah. Especially if it's a situation with the character being switched.
Right.
Yeah, and to that end, we talked about appearances, and especially how one presents in relation to, like, assumptions, even within music and classical music, about what choral role you have. And I know that, like, during the transition period, someone can start to develop, in your case, more masculine-looking features. And I know that the issue of being misgendered, especially in a musical setting, is what probably, I mean, is going to be painful anywhere, but it's particularly painful when you identify part of your own identity with, you know, singing and your own voice. But I'm wondering, how did that manifest in, like, the instrumental setting? For those of you who don't know, Devin and I played side by side in our orchestra at DePauw for like 2 years. I'm a clarinetist and Devin's a bassoonist, as he said. So there's a lot of overlap, and we shared many laughs sitting next to each other, even though we weren't supposed to be talking. But that aside, I'm wondering, like, in a setting that doesn't so heavily rely on the identification of the way you present, but is still going to take cues from that, did you notice any particular ways in which, when you were transitioning, that you were treated differently or different assumptions were made about you?
That's an interesting question. I think that I always used the bassoon and its, like, tenory bassy features as sort of an excuse to be able to participate in those lines. Whereas, you know, if I played flute or whatever, it would be a lot of the melody and a lot of, like, soprano-y stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
But with a bassoon, I was able to, you know, to put it creatively, sing as low as I wanted to, which was very cathartic for me, for sure. And the bassoon is an instrument that is pretty, I think it's, like, pretty evenly men and women play the bassoon, whereas like mostly women play the flute, or things like that. And so I think it would be a little bit of a different story if I was transitioning and playing the flute, because it's like, if you are a man who plays the flute, you already have to deal with some of the like gender stuff surrounding that. But the bassoon is very powerful yet light in a lot of ways, and so that sort of attracts all kinds of people, which is very nice. And so with the bassoon, it didn't really manifest. I didn't feel dysphoric when playing the bassoon the way that I felt dysphoric when I was singing. But I also didn't feel like I could express myself playing the bassoon as well as I could when singing. So it was kind of a trade-off. And that, is personal to me, and many people, including Sam, I would venture, are very good at expressing themselves when playing their instrument. And I loved playing the bassoon, but it wasn't pure Devin the way that I could experience when I was singing.
Interesting. Okay. Wow. Some of those things even I didn't know, but it's an interesting question to relate to. Was there any difference in, like, during the transition, did you notice any like particular differences in breath support or the way in which you played the bassoon? Were there any changes there at all? Oh,
definitely. I mean, the body changes, right?
Right.
And it can be anything from, I'm wearing this harness and I have things on my chest that I don't want that are getting in the way, to I am learning to speak and breathe differently because of my comfort or lack thereof. And also I just kind of got bigger. Like, testosterone doesn't necessarily like just make you bigger, but for me it kind of did. I don't know. Like, my shoulders got a little broader.
Oh, sure.
And like, you're like, now I like gain fat in different places than I used to. And lest we forget the way that you dress when you play instruments and you're in concert black or your recital wear or whatever, I definitely felt way more comfortable playing the bassoon in a tuxedo than I did in a floor-length black dress.
That does make sense.
Yeah, and like, if you're standing and playing an instrument, or standing and singing, or standing and doing whatever, high heels versus flat shoes also make a really big difference. And so, which is not to say that, obviously, only women can wear high heels and only men can wear flat shoes, because that's very silly, and more men should wear high heels.
Yeah.
But it is just sort of something that does kind of come with the territory. And we could, have a whole other podcast about how one can dress and what they can communicate when performing. But there were a lot of things that changed, and I think that for me, they definitely changed for the better, but it required a lot of adjustment, and I had a really, really excellent teacher, shout out to Calista, who was really great at sort of helping me through that, and being able to relate what I was going through sort of in my body with playing the bassoon. And then also, like, on kind of another note, playing the bassoon I was so much tighter when I played the bassoon than when I sang. My voice teacher didn't let me come to voice lessons on the same days as bassoon lessons, because my whole mouth, throat, everything was just shaped differently.
Wow.
Which is the case for pretty much anyone who would play the bassoon and sing, but there's just so much nuance in every possible aspect. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. And kind of related to that and to singing, actually, but it completely slipped my mind. I didn't even think about this, but I mean, it's a little personal, and if you don't want to talk about it, totally fine, obviously.
Yeah.
But with the idea of breath support changing and the physicality of singing and playing the bassoon, how, for many transmasculine people who have not had any kind of surgery yet, binding is a huge part of kind of gender euphoria, especially when you're out in public spaces. And I don't know, obviously, because that would be super creepy of me, but I imagine that in order to productively work on a wind instrument and a voice box, that binding just doesn't really mix well with that. So did that kind of, unless I'm totally wrong, and if I am, please just like say so. But
no, you're absolutely right. It was tricky for me because I felt great when I felt that I looked great when I would bind my chest. I mean, I was right, obviously, but
Yeah.
I also you can't breathe very well.
Yeah.
And it's also just like super not safe to be binding all the time. And so I found that if I was off from school and I wasn't practicing every day and I was binding more, my body just felt a lot worse. And so on a day-to-day basis, I wouldn't bind just because I needed to practice, and I needed to play in ensembles and stuff. And there's just not enough space. Like the compression is so tight that you just can't expand your chest the way that you need to when you are breathing well. And so there was definitely a little bit of a struggle there, but also the tuxedos that we wore for orchestra concerts, there's so many layers that you can't really tell when it's like under all that stuff.
Nice.
So that was also just kind of an extra difficult thing to navigate, because I wanted to feel good about how I looked, but it wasn't something that I could worry about every single day because I had other priorities. Totally. But I know other people who would bind every day and like, yes, that is such a super helpful thing to be able to do in terms of your own kind of self-image, but it also literally destroys your body. Which, through no fault of any transmasculine people, obviously, and no fault of the companies making the binders, it's just not good for you, And so, I mean, thankfully, I just got top surgery and don't really have to worry about that anymore, which is really great. But also, like, not a thing that a lot of people have access to. So, yeah, I mean, it's just a matter of prioritizing in that particular area.
I was just going to ask if since having top surgery, like, I can only imagine that of course the apparatus used to both play the bassoon and sing has, I'm assuming, drastically changed again, or or has it been much less of a transition in that way than perhaps I might expect?
I would be able to answer that question if I had practiced at all in the last 2 months.
That is fair.
But, I mean, it's even just as simple as, like, I stand up straighter now because I don't feel like I have anything to hide. Mm-hmm. And so I'm sure you're right. I'm sure that it has drastically changed. And I kind of have been singing to myself and stuff, but also haven't been going to choir because we're in a pandemic. So I'm definitely very excited to be able to go back to choir and to wear tight shirts all the time. But yeah, I mean, whether you're playing an instrument or singing, changes to your body will affect that just based on how you have to use your entire body to play an instrument or sing. And so it's just, I mean, we all have relationships with our bodies, right? And we all have little things like that we need to kind of accommodate for. And in my case, it just has a lot to do. It ties in very closely with my gender identity.
Yeah. That's one of the things I noticed most about a lot of the different kind of experiences you're referring to, that obviously due to the way that the musical world interacts with transness, it's way more extreme, it's way more, and it's also way more easy to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from. But a lot of the different kind of challenges that you're describing with regards to feeling like your voice doesn't fit you, or feeling like the way that you present physically doesn't really match the voice type you have, or things like that, or the way that any physical change affects the way that you make music, those are things that are really universal. So it's almost like, I don't know, it's affirming, but it's also really sad that we don't talk about it more, because this isn't something that's exclusively trans. Like, I'm a pretty tall person. I also am a soprano. Does that mean that they won't cast me if the tenor is too short? Probably.
Yeah.
Does it have anything to do with transness? Literally no, not at all.
Yeah.
And yet it's the exact same idea, but we don't talk about that either.
Yeah. I mean, the classical world is very exclusionary in a lot of fun, different ways, which is something that people our age are trying to fix.
Yeah. The part of the point of these podcasts is to kind of shine a light on the way that these different, I mean, like you say, exclusionary, or what, I mean, a lighter way to say it, but a little euphemistically, is just traditional, the traditionalism that's behind classical, but that the ways that things have been done in the past, just the idea that that's not necessarily the way that they have to happen in the future, or that they should happen in the future. And I think we're all working in our own little ways to try to correct some of those things that are not really acceptable in the 21st century.
I was just going to say we want to bring joy. That's all.
Aww. Well, Devin, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been very, very informative for me even, and I count you as one of my closest friends. So this has been wonderful, and thank you, Calista, for all your excellent questions. I know that personally I don't have as much experience with singing, but I'm glad that Devin's an excellent candidate because he plays both bassoon, something that I don't do, but I have more greater relationship to than singing, and you can help cover the singing part. So thank you both so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on the pod. Special shout out to my cat Lentil for interfering this entire time.
Yes, guest appearances by Lentil.
It's so nice to see and talk to both of you.